to your project here in Vancouver and the idea of sort of taking the spaces in between, those sort of spaces not often thought as of having great potential, and trying to turn that upside down and turn it into something really special. It's something in Vancouver we're working really hard on to activate the streets. We've got an amazing amount of conversation about putting food carts on the streets. Who would have thought you could have that conversation as long as we've had it, but it shows that there's a spirit and desire for us to do those things, like create much of your ideas for under the Granville Bridge. I think your project in Copenhagen as well spoke so beautifully to that. It's something we're not seeing perhaps enough of here, and I think the landscape architects identified that. Are there other cities on Earth that you think that would give us great examples in your experience for us to look to, besides Copenhagen, for activating public space?
I think in general, actually, I think like reference. You can see all of planet Earth is like one big urban laboratory where everywhere people are constantly conducting experiments in how to best inhabit, our planet. And the answers are very different in different cultures and different climates in different countries. And I think actually as a tool for, I think one day it could be interesting to make the coolest city in the world simply by sampling elements, maybe the level, the grades changed bicycle lane of Copenhagen is a pretty nice bicycle lane, and it's much nicer than the one in New York, because the cars don't care about the graphics that somebody painted. They'll just so it's highly dangerous, but it keeps you awake. And then maybe they're in Japan, they have an amazing fire hose, and so I think in a way what we did in Copenhagen, getting people to nominate stuff. Really apart from adding color and excitement to the urban environment, it has also given us some straightforward inventions that might almost invasive species. We might not have Canadian bicycle racks with bicycle pumps everywhere, because it's just a better bicycle rack than the non-pump one that we have. So I think in that sense. A lot of evolution actually happens through migration, and I think in general this being much more promiscuous about sampling other people's and other countries and other cultures' ideas and just incorporating them would be highly productive.
I think the observation here is that we're just anxious for that next step. We sort of have all these great possibilities, but we're not jumping into them yet. And so, I'm very encouraged with the idea of the underside of the bridge, and the hope is that we could find many, many more spaces. One of the other things, and Trevor, I'm going to turn it over to you because I don't know who you've got, but if you have Andrew over there to speak to, is the idea that Vancouver is unique, unlike, for instance, Central Park, the way it sort of resides as the center of the whole. Vancouver lacks that space to some degree, although many of us would argue that the Vancouver Art Gallery sits as that real presence in the center of the city and with its public space out front. We don't have that large center, and that's something that I think is something that many crave here, and it's difficult to create once we've got the context we have. And Trevor, perhaps we can sort of pick up on that thread and let Andrew speak to it.
I think one of the things that kind of struck me in the last few years of Vancouver development is we've invested $500 million in a roof stadium in the middle of our city that is occupied maybe, 10 days a month. Actually in May it's 4 days of activity in BC Place. We've invested another $500 million in a convention center with a green roof that we can't really access. There's no, it's an iconic building in some respects, but there's no publicness to it, to that idea. And I think it'd be interesting for us to really play that perspective and reverse it a bit and look at the spaces between buildings. You look at BC Place and the spaces around them are unchanged, and they have a kind of a lack of vitality. And the images you showed of how you might occupy the underside of a bridge, that lacks a kind of vitality, and the slides that you show of hundreds of ideas, and to my students who are here, that's exactly what I'm talking about in terms of illustrating the program and showing the opportunity is what we're talking about, is what I'm trying to get at with those points. And I think we tend to get a little weak-kneed for some reason in our city about programming and adding that vitality. We saw great examples of it during the Olympics. We saw Robson Square with a zip line in it. And my question is, why don't we have it there all the time? Why don't we have that kind of program there every day and give that kind of vitality back to the city? So that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Joe. Next, I'd like to invite Kelty McKinnon come up, who's a partner at Phillips, Farvag, Smallenberg Landscape Architects. And why don't you just carry on the same line? I mean, what could more thoughtful use of public space do for the city? What would you like to see happen?
Hi, I'll carry on with Joe's pro-landscape architecture theme. I think as landscape architects, we really suffer from being the invisible ones. You know, we're creating the void to architecture's object. And I think, carry on with that, I think activity between buildings is really something that we also deal with kind of on a daily basis. And we're also designing program when we're designing landscapes, as architects are as well. But I think what Vancouver really lacks, and it's been alluded to several times by many of the speakers, and Ian in his introduction, is Vancouver kind of suffers from its beauty in that it's become a distraction for us almost from a real solid, eccentric urban life. Vancouver is incredibly beautiful, but it's a manicured, vacuous beauty as far as I'm concerned, and I think I've heard a lot of people speak about Vancouver that way. And I'm not sure what the answer is to that. I think what we have proposed in our sentence is to create a kind of a secondary public realm system of eccentric spaces that can be inhabited in a variety of ways and programmed in a way that somehow has a public-private partnership that can enable all of the spaces, all of the urban activities that were shown, Bjarke, in 1400 Howe, that we've brainstormed on that project. And somehow that needs to happen in a way that's enabling rather than debilitating by city legislation. So, thanks.
Thank you, Kelty. And just one final word on this topic from Andrew from the Vancouver Public Space Network. Andrew.
Thank you very much. My idea for being a chief architect in the city, thank you, was to actually pick up on a bit of work that we've been doing in the city for about 50 years now, and that was to think about the idea of developing a heart for Vancouver. We have, as Kelty pointed out, all sorts of wonderful spaces, edge spaces, parks, plazas, opportunities for people to gaze wistfully across to the North Shore Mountains. But what we've really been lacking is a central square, a central public square, a grand gathering place in the middle to complement these places. Joe Fry, who you just heard of, actually developed a wonderful concept, one of our winning entries in a design competition we had a few years ago called Where is this Square? This is a question that Vancouver's actually been pondering for the better part of 50 years. We've been talking about having a public square and we've never yet developed it. So my idea was a simple one, hopefully an elegant one for the city. Let's design that square. Let's do it. Let's give people a gathering place so that we can really celebrate public life in the heart of Vancouver. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew Pask. And now back to you, Michael, for our last section.
It's very game show-like, this whole sort of setup that we've got. The sort of
I'm
last...
not Vanna White. I'm not manicured and perfect.
I don't know what my role is here. So I think the other question, Bjarke, maybe we can touch on is with public space in Vancouver, one of the challenges obviously are weather as well. And when I first moved here about 14 years ago, what I observed coming from New York is where there are a number of spaces that are winter garden type spaces that sort of recognize the need for unprogrammed public space that is also accessible in the wintertime. Is there anything from that point of view of, we currently only have shopping malls largely, and thankfully a really great space in our Vancouver Public Library that's sort of an unprogrammed, enclosed space. Are there any examples of that you might cite? And how does Copenhagen with similar weather actually address sort of the wintertime public space issue?
You take it like a man.
There we go.
I don't know. Like I do think it was kind of funny because like in the House Street project, the issue came up about weather protection, and I mean the whole project is underneath the canopy of the bridges. So like to add more weather protection seems like insane. But I mean I do think. Like, especially in a city like Vancouver or Copenhagen, if you're gonna have a car, you really want to have a convertible one, because like when the sun is shining, you are gonna harvest every single second of it, because like it's so rare. So I mean, I think that there is. I really think there's a lot of ways. I mean, I really think outdoor has a unique quality to it, and it has like a generosity. And also, I think a lot of the spaces you refer to in New York have a tendency to be like incredibly over-governed. Also, that there's some door guy that's gonna hassle you if you do anything that's not predetermined. So in that sense, they might be unprogrammed, but that's because they really don't want you to sit on that bench because it's not there, because you can't sleep on it if you're homeless. Like I think there's all these, like in Copenhagen, you would do every effort you could to saturate the degree of invitation that a space would have, whereas in New York, it's always like trying to find ways of avoiding that people sleep there, and I think in many ways. I don't think the weather's that bad here, and I think that the more you can make the outdoor realm, the literally outdoor realm, inviting and stimulating, the more people can actually endure. It's like 10, 15 years ago, people would not sit outside in Denmark in October, and now just through like consistently having blankets available at the cafes. And heaters, the sort of the outdoor season has maybe expanded with like 2 or 3 months, almost in both directions. So a lot of it is also just like really insisting on that the air is actually fresher outside. And now that you've banned smoking everywhere, you can also smoke outside, which has like boosted the outdoor realm even more. So I think in that sense, it's just really about trying to improve the outdoor conditions rather than trying to replace it with like a hermetic but semi-public interior.
Let's we'll keep the issues going here. And this next stage here is probably the meatiest subject we're going to tackle. It's the rules. And I think we've talked about it a few times. One of the challenges is that sense that regulation prevents us from doing what we want to do, and that sense that perhaps perseverance and fighting the battle is what actually gets us to great architecture. One question that came up to me is it easier, as an architect that works around the world, is it easier for you to arrive in a city with sort of fresh ideas and present them to a community than it would be for you to present those same ideas at home? And much of your work you also get through competition, which gives you an opportunity to sort of just insert it. But do you find that there is a difference in the way you approach work at home versus abroad? And is there an ability to be more fresh when you're abroad? I don't see that in the work, but it's a question.
Yeah. I mean, I think we talked about it before. Like, I think everybody thinks that their city, all architects thinks that their city is like the most difficult city to work in the world, that the building regulations are like the worst, and the city officials are like the most hardcore, and the developer's the most stingy or whatever. But I think fact remains that it's the same everywhere. Like it's same but different. Like you know, it's a lot easier to do a tall building in Vancouver than it is in Copenhagen. I can tell you that for sure. But
is it arbitrary? So if you consider it here, it's an interesting thing. When you arrive with fresh eyes in our city, is it the height limits on our buildings and the density we were talking about earlier, does it just feel relatively arbitrary as an outsider arriving here?
no, I mean, I think it's quite, it was quite quick to access the sort of the criteria that is the foundation of the legislation, like the whole idea about identifying like major important moments in the city where certain views have been governed by the view cones, for instance, makes it like, you know, that's, you know, I get it. So, okay, we're outside the view cones, so we should be able to build tall. And so I think, but there's always these principles, and you have like different emphasis. I was actually also surprised because like, when you come...
We're going to fly up there.
It's like an ecosystem. It's like sort of some kind of highly toxic insect.
It's impressive you guys can see that fly from the distance.
I lost it. Yeah, it was something about. No, yeah, exactly. It was so. It was interesting to me because, like, coming from Copenhagen, like there is nothing but skyscrapers in Vancouver, so that the fact that there was actually a very careful height discussion was like a pleasant surprise, because I had definitely imagined that it was just the product of complete freedom to go as tall as you want. So I'm not totally sure. I think our general experience is just like once you go behind the scenes and you figure out what actually happened in the design process and what informed the design process, a project is quite often much more careful and considerate than the general assumption that it's just some kind of a napkin sketch that got built. And it's the same, like once you arrive in a new place, they have actually been messing with it for like decades or like hundreds of years or even millennia. And the local population have actually probably figured out a few things about how to inhabit this particular place, in this particular culture, in this particular climate. And I think what we try to do is instantly try to tap in to that knowledge. Because like if you stand on the shoulders of your predecessors, you can reach a lot higher. And I always had the principle, like I think a lot of them, one of the dangers against, or like one of the hindrances against actually developing original work as an architect is the insistence on doing something original. Because I really think you become a better architect by studying architecture. And in a way by learning from the past and even the present. It's better to learn from the past because like dead architects don't sue you. You can actually reach much further instead of starting from scratch every time. Mm-hmm. The danger of the tabula rasa, the danger of the revolution is that when you cut off the head of the entire elite and you burn the libraries and the churches and break down the roads and the bridges, you lose so much knowledge and so much information and so much invested interest, and you have to start from scratch. So I think most revolutions end up with something that was worse than what you replaced. Look at Iran. And I think in that sense, evolution is really the process of sort of picking up where the last man left the job and taking it one step further.
And part of the evolution, though, is still that it needs the catalyst for change. It's the oyster and the pearl, right? The pearl and the oyster. So the ability, I would suggest for us here in Vancouver, the ability to introduce new architects to our system is just that. It's the catalyst to provoke this change. And so certainly for me personally, that's what's very exciting about your project, and speaking to ideas like Bruce's about bringing other sort of catalysts for that change to just spark that new creativity. But part of it is actually also sort of understanding how when that creativity comes to town, how it has a unique opportunity to potentially push the boundaries of some of the rules. And I think you're right, that the rules are the rules wherever you may go, and as an architect you have to work within them and at the same time stretch their envelope as much as possible. But this is an opportunity where perhaps we are in a unique opportunity right now where we don't have currently a city planner. We're transitioning with a new city planner, and that opportunity of how we see ourselves in the future is going to be really interesting. So it's perhaps a chance for us to revisit the playbook a little bit and see how these catalyst projects might change that. I'm going to do a little, just to keep the ball rolling. I can see Trevor waving at me. Oops, sorry, I'm back up here. On the rules, there was a number of good comments that came from various people, including Richard Enriquez. So perhaps we can go to Trevor.
Thank you, Michael. I want to compliment you all for sticking around. This is a truly Vancouver moment. 1,000 people, 3 hours into this. So your first of your rewards for staying with us now. I'm about to make a momentous announcement. This is the first public announcement of the new chief planner for Vancouver, is represented on the screen right now. The genetic team under city manager Penny Ballum have taken the genes of Leibniz, Bach, Mozart, Sir Christopher Wren, Karl Marx, and Adam Smith, and put them together in the new chief planner for Vancouver. No, it's not going to happen. It hasn't happened. But I think our senior rule maker, the chief planner, if you want, is a pretty important role. We had some very, very, very specific proposals from people about the rules that should be changed to make a better city. And I'd like to ask Richard Enriquez to come up for a moment. Richard is one of Canada's most distinguished and accomplished architects, the rare architect who also deserves the title of artist for his paintings, his mobiles, his installations. But it's the architect and the urban designer and Richard that proposed something very specific here. I'll read a sentence of it and then let Richard explain what it means. He says, many city policies discourage the creation of beautiful buildings, primarily because as densities increase, there was not a proportional increase in the permitted building envelope. And he goes on to say, in order for there to be a superb architectural response to any particular building program, flexibility is required in the permitted form of development. Richard, what do you think, and how could this be done?
Well, I think, I think if you look at the projects that were displayed tonight and ask yourself what the zoning entitlement was for them and whether there were building envelopes described within which they had to fit, you would conclude that they weren't, and that there was a great deal of flexibility in the response that could be given to any particular problem. Vancouver zoning entitlement is such that we describe very specific zoning envelopes. And the tendency has been, as the projects have been gotten larger, like Concord or Bayshore, to go from a subdivision to a project plan to a parcel plan with an envelope, and then to architecture. Used to be, if you look at the West End, for instance, there was a survey and then there was architecture. Years ago, there was a competition for the Bayshore project, and I proposed resurveying the water lots, which were now land, and then assigning those water lots to individual architects. And I invited Isosaki and a number of local architects to participate in this. And the whole idea was a little bit absurd because there were no zoning entitlements. And the way we get in zoning entitlements with density and height and so on has become so specific that I think a lot of creativity has been, is diminished on account of that. If you look at the downtown district, for instance. It used to be a very flexible zone. The uses were flexible. You had enough height with the densities that were there. But now, as densities get higher and higher, with the height limits that we have, the envelope that we end up with is simply too tight. And if you add the view cones on top of that, you end up with a situation where there is absolutely no choice of the form of development. You can't respond to specific policies the city may have for creating extra density for social housing. You can't create public open space at grade. You can't respond properly to the neighbors because you're too close. And consequently, I think we need to go and revisit how zoning entitlements are given and find ways of giving bigger envelopes, more flexibility. And I think in that way we'll probably end up with better architecture.
Thank you, Richard. Now it's time for our very last community contributors comment of the evening. We made a point of asking artists and writers to contribute. We have one from Douglas Copeland. As the project evolves, there'll be more involvement of many, many communities in this project. But it's a great pleasure to introduce to you Ken Lum, who's one of Canada's really top internationally showing, writing, curating artists. He's taught here at UBC in the past. He's now a restaurateur, a public intellectual, and a man who's transformed the city at the micro and macro scale. In our contributions, they range from 800 words to 8 words, or 5 words, Jim Chang's. But the Zen masters standing before you, 8 letters constituted the entire submission of Ken Lum. And those 8 letters spell 2 4-letter words in Japanese, wabi sabi. What do you mean by that, Ken?
Well, first of all, I want to know why the air conditioning is on. I thought this was about sustainability. Well, in shorthand, wabi-sabi is really, I think, about the Japanese aesthetics of what's necessary. And of course, it lends itself to ideas of minimalism and functionalism, but it doesn't have to be about that. It's also imbued with the character of melancholia in respect to the question of the passage of time and so on. You can look that up. It's a very complex term. But one thing I want to concentrate on is the notion of discontinuity, which I think is something which should be embraced. And also discontinuity I think is a much more complex term than diversity, which has a kind of UN quality to it, and so it's more acceptable, right? But discontinuity is also linked to the idea of circulation, because I think you have to, you can only experience discontinuity if you move from one continuity to a different continuity, and so on. And I can give you an example. I think New York Manhattan, for example, is such a great city because you have, even in the Upper East Side, which is very elite, you can have, circulations of Peruvian immigrants, all kinds of cheap diners, the street carts, all kinds of stuff within, 2 blocks of, multi-million-dollar homes. So you have this kind of circulation that's going on here. And second anecdote I would mention would be in terms of this question of discontinuity, which we always see as a kind of problem in Vancouver, is the Granville Mall, for example. For many, many years, I remember the debate was always about how, it's a problem. And I went to a city hall meeting one time, and all these people were saying, we have to do something about Granville Mall because there's nobody down there, right? And yet every time I was down there, it was full of street kids and punks with mohawks and goths and so on. So I didn't quite understand what they meant by there's nobody down there. It's completely lively. There's bong shops and so on. Right? It's just that it was discontinuous with what they expected in terms of the city, right? And so I think the sad paradox of this city is that the areas that are the least discontinuous, that is the areas that are the least interesting, and the areas that have the least in terms of circulations of different peoples and so on, is actually the paragon or the template for the way we want to live. I think that's a real sad part. So you can actually have, for example, in a development in Abbotsford, and it would brand itself as Why pay West Point Grey prices? You can live in West Point Grey conditions here in the valley, right? Or, development in Port Moody could say, you don't need to pay Kitsilano prices. Just live here. This is Kitsilano at the end of Burrard Inlet, right? To me, I mean, that's a kind of a problem, because I think the greatest failure of the city is this lack of embrace of discontinuity and circulation, and the areas that should be the least emulated should be the areas of Point Grey, Kitsilano, UBC.
Thank you very much, Ken. And discontinuously back to you, Bjarke, for a comment.
Bjarke, this is what you offered us, and it really does do a great job of summarizing the evening. So I'm going to just turn it over to you, let you read it, and tell us why.
I'll just read it then. Enforce the spirit, not the letter. I was about to propose approve the House Street project, but this could lead to the same. Enforce the spirit, not the letter of the code. Focus on the big public picture and allow freedom in the little personal details. Encourage the careful, awaken the careless. Welcome extraordinary projects when they come with extraordinary ambition and commitment.
And that pretty much summarizes the evening. Thank you. What I'd like to do now is actually tell you about, very quickly, the last little piece of it, of tonight. When Ian initially asked Leslie and I and Trevor and others to get involved in setting this evening up, it was about more than just having a lecture. It was more about trying to find some means of creating a measurable result. How could we, a year from now, come back and say that this was the beginning of a conversation that actually led to results? What actions could we come up with? And what we're going to introduce tonight is a website that we call unsolicitedvancouver.com. And it's a website that's designed to, the first thing it'll do is it'll actually have the video of Bjarke's talk tonight, and I suppose this part of the conversation as well. It'll have all of the participants, the writing that they did in answering that question of what they would do as the chief architect. But it'll become a place, most importantly, for all of you and for the entire city to contribute new ideas, both architectural ideas, as well as policy and writing ideas about how we can elevate the results of the buildings and the public space that we make here. The idea is that sometimes to do that, we actually have to break out of the rules. We actually have to challenge the status quo. We have to ignore the rules that already exist. We possibly, if you're a young architect, you have to put a proposal out there that you aren't being paid for, that perhaps somebody else is. But somehow we have to have a vehicle, and this website will be it, for you to showcase your ideas to challenge the status quo. And our goal is that if we can gather over the next year as many of these ideas as possible, some beautiful designs for things we never imagined, spaces, solutions for spaces in between, solutions that may not have a client, that this site then becomes something that we can talk about next year at an event hopefully similar to this, that it's a place where we can pull out the best of those, and we're putting together an award hopefully for the best of those projects next year, to try to celebrate the creative capacity to this community to think outside the box, and especially for the younger generation to find a tool to show what you can do without necessarily having your career already well underway and have the connections to get that client you need. So this is the place for the site, and the site will go up. It's already up tonight just as a placeholder. Over the next 2 or 3 weeks, you'll see it start to populate. And those that are interested can drop their email into it so that we make sure you stay informed about what's happening on Unsolicited. That's the end of the evening. I want to thank Bjarke for just a brilliant talk and your contribution throughout the night. It's been fantastic. Thank you.
With pleasure.